Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Giuseppe Mazzotta, the Sterling Professor of Italian Language and Literature at Yale University. He's here at Oregon as a guest lecturer for the Medieval Studies program, which is currently celebrating the 700th anniversary of the birth of the great poet Petrarch. Giuseppe Mazzotta earned his BA and MA at the University of Toronto and his PhD at Cornell. He's an internationally recognized scholar whose research focuses on medieval and Renaissance Italian literature, especially the works of Petrarch, Vico, and Dante. He's a prolific writer and an eloquent speaker. His articles have been published in numerous professional journals. He's the author of at least 6 books, including Cosmopoesis, the Renaissance Experiment, published in 2001, The New Map of the World, the Poetic Philosophy of Giambattista Vico, 1998, and The Worlds of Petrarch, 1993. It's always great to have you in Oregon.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you first came in
Just about 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
7 years ago.
Right.
1996.
Right, and tell us about that, because we talked earlier. You remember that was a month you spent here?
That was in 1997, I believe. But I had come here in 1996, invited by the Italian department. And I came and spoke about Vico. I was preparing a book on Vico that you mentioned, and I gave another talk on utopian thought of the Renaissance. I came then a year later, a guest of your center, and it's really one of the memorable times of my life. I did a lot of work. You have a splendid library. It was a summertime, so nobody was using the books I needed, and I could have access to them.
And the weather's nice here in the summer.
Oh, it was,
compared with New Haven.
It was wonderful.
Pretty nice.
It was wonderful. We ought to arrange another visit
that
like
would be
that.
Great. That would be great.
I'm already proposing a project for the future.
Excellent.
Like
and you have former students here.
I do.
There are a lot of connections between you and the University of Oregon.
Yeah,
it's rather remarkable.
There's actually the two Italianists one. I hesitate to say that they were my students because you know what it means.
Yes.
It's like I'm patronizing. They're two brilliant Italianists. Gina Psaki, who was a student of mine at Cornell, and then there is Massimo Rollini, who became a student of mine at Yale. And then, of course, there's Warren the Ginsberg, who was never really a student, but a great colleague at Yale, and a friend, became a dear friend, and then you became a friend.
Right.
In fact, I think of you as a friend.
Absolutely. Well, it's always great to have you back.
Thank
you. You bring an uncommon energy and passion.
Thank you.
And again, a kind of a direct speaking that you don't often find in American academia. So that's
I think that's an American trait, and probably that's why. This is why
What's
I like
an American trait?
direct speaking.
In academia?
No, in Oregon maybe. I think that I find that in Oregon more than I find it elsewhere. You know, the academia is always a world of a brilliant world, but a world of distinctions, very careful distinctions. And here I find it refreshing that we can.
When you say distinctions, what do you mean by that?
Very carefully drawn. It's this.
Who's this and who's this?
On the one hand, you have this. On the other hand, you have something else. And that this is what I call almost the scholastic distinctions. And they are crucial. They are part of our intellectual rigor. But I think that the moment comes when we really say exactly what we want to say, and it becomes a necessity for us to have clear ideas and think very clearly about some issues. And the seminar we had today was a case in point. You were present, and there was a question about how to read texts and what are the values that we move forth when we read texts, to what extent we put ourselves and our beliefs. And we challenge value systems through our readings, but then we also have to stage our own beliefs, and there's no way of going about it as if these things don't matter. To do that, not to speak about our judgments, our values, and the responsibilities that go with it, I think it's a way of skirting the issue.
Well, I like what you said, because you said if you think a poem is a great poem, you say it. You make these judgments.
To say it.
But that's not the common.
No, because we really like to believe that we should not make judgments. Because judgments, of course, imply responsibility and imply a kind of positioning of oneself in a field where our own opinions are going to be challenged. But I think that we should welcome the very opportunity of having our ideas challenged. Because when I'm expressing a judgment, I'm challenging somebody else's values.
But you don't work on Dante because he's happens to have written in the Middle Ages. You work on him because he's, well, partially that, but he's a great poet.
He's a great poet, and I think that, in fact, I am a medievalist for a number of complicated reasons, but I really, as you pointed out, have been working throughout the spectrum. Have been moving across the arc of Italian and, to some extent, European literary history, certainly not with a kind of generosity and breadth that you show going from China. You are global. I am more Eurocentric, but I view that as a price I pay for
knowing what you're talking about.
Well, no, not only that, but for the kind of professional, the sense of professional belonging and professional responsibility. I feel that if I don't talk about this text, nobody else will. So that it becomes a kind of moral imperative for me to stick to some authors, medieval, Renaissance, early modern.
Well, now one of the legacies of the modern historical sciences seems to have been a rejection of universals. I don't know whether you agree with me about that. And we're told, and this is common parlance, I think, today in cultural studies, literary and cultural studies, that everything is a product of a particular moment, unique historical circumstances. Sure. And so how does your work interact and respond to this climate of opinion?
Well, I like the challenge that comes from some quarters about the notion of absolutes, you know, that you cannot speak of absolutes. And the way I like to explain these things to my students, if I may, I mean, and then I am going to hopefully answer your question with the rigor it demands. I always say to my students, look, if a guy comes to your house and says to you, I love you, relatively speaking, I think you should really kick him in there where the moon doesn't shine and get rid of this guy. There are things that you cannot really accept as relative. Style, a poem, a line of a poem has its absolute necessity. And it's what it is, not because it was arranged by chance or relatively. It had its own necessity. And there are a number of other values that I can go on, very human values. The idea of aware of the moral ambiguities of the world in which we live, but aware also of the need to take some stance. You can't say you see violence around you, and you cannot really say, well, I can see the point of view of the victimizer. Of course, I can see the point of view of the victimizer, but that's not the way you express a point of view. So there are certain things that necessarily. Now, intellectually, which is your question, how do I respond to those ideas? I think that I try to be as very careful, first of all, about the challenges that come to us from a number of sources. And the number of sources that, in intellectual terms, they end up really in some kind of impasse. That is to say, literary texts are self-referential. That's the primary one. Or they express a relative point of view of an author who is in time and therefore limited in his knowledge, her knowledge, by that position in time. I say, well, that's fine. Nonetheless, literary texts, to view them as purely formal constructs, is really a way of violating the complexities. There is no such a thing as an aesthetic value which is limited and self-enclosed. In my world, in the way I read literature, aesthetics leads to ethics, ethics leads to politics, politics leads me to economics. Reality is too prismatic, and to focus on one aspect alone is a way of betraying the complexity of texts, and by the way, the complexities of life. So I really like to think of in terms of literary responses which are encyclopedic in nature. They involve the whole discourse of human beings. It doesn't mean that I think that I know everything that there is to be known. No, it only means, of course, I don't know everything that is to be known, but it means that I must have an openness to all the possible discourses around me, all the possible disciplines. I'm not alien to talking about geometry and justice. I'm not alien to talking about beauty and justice. I wonder, you know, I have to wonder, why does justice need beauty to appeal to people? Why does it have to be expressed in terms of harmony? It forces me to go at questions such as fundamental issues such as justice in terms of its aesthetic appearance. And texts help me in raising these issues.
Now, when you talk about aesthetic appearance and aesthetics and beauty and so on now, is the climate different in American, or at least literary and cultural studies today with regard to raising questions of aesthetics? I mean,
Absolutely.
10, 15 years ago, nobody wanted to talk about beauty. Is this, you feel this has changed in your colleagues?
Absolutely. This is really what has been happening. I think that we have moved away from the kind of close readings, very rigorous but mindless, as if we're just responding to questions of ironies, really descriptions of literary texts. We are now raising issues about what is what does beauty tell me about the world?
So what about the
why does it have to be? What is the need to pursue
this
idea such as the beautiful, which is the old classical idea, and the perception that that we love beauty? What is the urge within us that makes us ascend the ladder of being in order to come to a perception of the beautiful? These are now questions that maybe thanks to a kind of philosophical sophistication, we start asking about literary texts. And I think they have been moving on to center stage of the literary debates. We are no longer talking in terms of intentional fallacies or intentionality of a text. We are really raising issue about what does literature tell us about the world that other discourses fail to tell us. Economics, in other words, the encyclopedia is a very complicated business. It's not just a way of saying that literature is like politics, like ethics. No, it has the role of countering those values, adding on to a perception of the world in a way that a purely utilitarian discourse cannot do, a moralistic discourse cannot do, a political discourse cannot do. It questions the hegemony of those discourses and adds to them in a ways that really would have to be answered by looking at closely some literary texts and not in some sort of generalized way. But I can give you an example if you were to ask me at some point in a conversation.
Well, I think what you just said is after all, this program is a product of the Oregon Humanities Center, and you've just made a very eloquent defense of the humanities, and particularly of poetry. And so I appreciate that. I want to talk to you now a bit about some of the lectures you've been giving, some of the talks you've been giving here for this week. And this week, in the lectures you've given here, you talked about Vico and Native Americans. You've talked about Dante in relation to Hinduism, and I guess it was Hinduism. Now, how are these references?
Hinduism and the Muslim
and Islam. Yes.
Islam.
And I'd like to. Tell me about the relation between these references you've made and what seems to be this new attempt of yours to breathe life into universalism. And maybe you could tell our audience, if you want to just say something, what